What if I told you that the greatest psychologist of the 20th century identified exactly 10 behaviors that will destroy any relationship you're in? Carl Jung, the man who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, didn't just study the mind, he studied the heart, the soul, and the dark patterns that poison love itself. Right now, as you're watching this video, you might be tolerating one of these toxic behaviors without even realizing it. And according to Jung's profound insights into human nature, continuing to accept these patterns isn't just damaging your relationship, it's slowly destroying your very sense of self. If you want to protect your heart and build the authentic, passionate relationship you deserve, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Because what I'm about to share with you could be the difference between a lifetime of authentic love and years of psychological manipulation. Jung spent decades analyzing the human psyche, diving deep into the unconscious patterns that govern our relationships. Through his work with thousands of patients, he discovered that certain behaviors aren't just red flags, they're psychological poison that seeps into every aspect of our being. Today, we're going to explore the 10 most dangerous relationship behaviors that Jung identified as absolutely unacceptable. These aren't just relationship advice tips, they're psychological truths that could save your sanity and your soul. The first behavior might shock you because it's something most people consider normal in relationships. But Jung understood that what we accept as normal is often what destroys us from within. And here's what's truly terrifying. Studies show that 87% of people in toxic relationships don't even recognize these patterns until it's too late. Don't let that be you. Stay with me as we dive deep into Jung's revolutionary insights. The first unacceptable behavior Jung identified is what modern psychology calls emotional vampirism. But Jung understood it on a much deeper level. He called it psychological possession, when someone systematically drains your emotional energy to feed their own ego. Jung observed that some individuals operate like psychological parasites, unable to generate their own emotional stability. Instead, they latch onto others, creating what he termed unconscious feeding patterns that leave their partners feeling depleted, confused, and questioning their own reality. This isn't just about someone having a bad day or needing support. This is about a consistent pattern where one person becomes the emotional feeding ground for another's psychological needs. Jung noted that these individuals often have what he called an underdeveloped anima or animus. Essentially, they haven't integrated their own emotional complexity and instead project it onto others. The warning signs are subtle but devastating. You find yourself constantly managing their emotions while your own needs disappear. You become their emotional regulation system, their mood stabilizer, their psychological crutch. Jung warned that this creates what he called psychological inflation in the vampire and psychological deflation in the victim. What makes this particularly insidious is that emotional vampires often disguise their behavior as love or need. They'll say things like, "You're the only one who understands me," or "I can't live without you." But Jung understood that genuine love creates psychological growth in both partners, not depletion in one. The most dangerous aspect of emotional vampirism is how it slowly erodes your connection to your own unconscious. Jung believed that our psychological health depends on maintaining a strong relationship with our inner world. When someone constantly demands our emotional energy, we lose touch with our own dreams, intuitions, and creative impulses. Jung's patients, who had experienced emotional vampirism, often reported feeling like they were living someone else's life or losing themselves in the relationship. This isn't metaphorical. It's a real psychological phenomenon where your own identity becomes secondary to managing another person's emotional chaos. But here's what Jung discovered that most people don't know. There's a specific psychological technique that can immediately identify an emotional vampire. Keep watching because I'm about to reveal exactly how to spot this pattern before it destroys your psyche. The second behavior Jung considered absolutely unacceptable is what he termed malicious shadow projection. When someone consistently projects their own dark qualities onto you, making you the scapegoat for their unconscious issues. Jung's concept of the shadow represents all the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge: our selfishness, our cruelty, our pettiness. Healthy individuals work to integrate their shadow through self-reflection and personal growth. But some people take a different, toxic approach. They project their shadow onto their partner. This creates a psychological hell where you're constantly being blamed for qualities that actually belong to them. If they're selfish, they'll accuse you of being self-centered. If they're manipulative, they'll claim you're trying to control them. If they're dishonest, they'll question your integrity at every turn. Jung observed that this behavior serves a dual purpose for the projector. It allows them to avoid confronting their own darkness while simultaneously making their partner doubt their own perception of reality. It's a form of psychological gaslighting that Jung identified long before the term existed. The devastating effect of shadow projection is that it slowly convinces you that you're the problem in the relationship. You begin to question your own motives, your own character, your own worth. Jung called this psychological inversion, where the victim begins to carry the psychological burden of the perpetrator's shadow. What makes shadow projection particularly dangerous is that it often contains just enough truth to be believable. We all have flaws. We all have shadow aspects. A skilled projector will identify your real weaknesses and then magnify them while completely ignoring their own, much more serious issues. Jung worked with many patients who had been victims of shadow projection, and he noted that they often developed what he called shadow inflation, becoming overly focused on their own flaws while remaining blind to their partner's massive psychological problems. The healing process for shadow projection victims, according to Jung, involves learning to differentiate between legitimate self-reflection and psychological manipulation. It requires developing what he called psychological discrimination, the ability to see clearly what belongs to you and what belongs to the other person. Jung developed a specific exercise that can instantly reveal when someone is engaging in shadow projection. This technique has helped thousands of people reclaim their psychological clarity. Don't miss this crucial insight. It's coming up in just a moment. The third unacceptable behavior Jung identified is what he called Anima or Animus possession in relationships. When someone becomes completely identified with their contrasexual archetype and loses all psychological balance, Jung believed that every person has both masculine and feminine psychological principles within them. The anima represents the feminine aspect in men, while the animus represents the masculine aspect in women. When these archetypes are healthy and integrated, they contribute to psychological wholeness and authentic relationships. But when someone becomes possessed by their anima or animus, they lose touch with their conscious personality and begin acting out unconscious patterns that are destructive to relationships. An anima-possessed man might become overly emotional, moody, and manipulative, using his feelings as weapons rather than tools for connection. Similarly, an animus-possessed woman might become overly aggressive, critical, and domineering, using logic and analysis to control rather than to understand. Jung observed that these possessions create relationships where one person is constantly dealing with an unconscious archetype rather than a conscious human being. The terrifying aspect of animus possession is that the possessed person often believes they're expressing their true self when they're actually being controlled by unconscious forces. They might say things like, "This is just who I am," or "I'm being authentic," while engaging in behaviors that are clearly destructive. Jung noted that relationships with possessed individuals feel like walking on eggshells because you never know which aspect of their personality will emerge. One moment they might be loving and connected, the next they might be completely different, as if they've been taken over by an alien force. The most dangerous aspect of animus possession is that it prevents genuine intimacy. Instead of relating to you as a real person, the possessed individual relates to you through the lens of their archetypal projections. You become a character in their unconscious drama rather than a partner in a conscious relationship. Jung's treatment for animus possession involved helping patients recognize when they were being controlled by these unconscious forces and learning to differentiate between archetypal reactions and authentic responses. This process, which he called active imagination, requires tremendous psychological courage and self-awareness. The warning signs of animus possession are subtle but unmistakable once you know what to look for. Jung identified 7 specific behaviors that indicate someone is being controlled by these unconscious forces. Keep watching to learn exactly what these signs are. The 4th behavior Jung considered absolutely unacceptable is what he termed psychological inflation. When someone develops a grandiose sense of self that makes genuine relationship impossible, Jung observed that some individuals become so identified with their ego that they lose all capacity for genuine connection. They see themselves as superior, special, or uniquely gifted, and they expect their partners to constantly validate this inflated self-image. This isn't simple narcissism, though it shares some characteristics. Jung's concept of psychological inflation is more complex. It involves someone becoming possessed by what he called archetypal energy without the consciousness to contain it properly. An inflated person might believe they're destined for greatness, that ordinary rules don't apply to them, or that they possess special insights that others lack. They often speak in grandiose terms about their plans, their abilities, or their unique understanding of life. The devastating effect on relationships is that inflated individuals cannot see their partners as separate, valuable beings. Instead, they see others as extensions of themselves, as admirers in their personal drama, or as obstacles to their grandiose vision. Jung noted that psychological inflation often develops as a defense against deep feelings of inadequacy or trauma. The inflated ego becomes a protective shell that prevents the person from experiencing vulnerability or authentic connection. Living with an inflated person means constantly feeding their ego while sacrificing your own needs and identity. They require constant admiration, agreement, and validation. Any attempt to express different opinions or needs is seen as a personal attack on their grandiose self-image. What makes psychological inflation particularly toxic is that it often comes packaged with genuine talents or insights. The inflated person might actually be gifted in some areas, which makes their grandiosity seem justified and their criticism of others appear valid. Jung's approach to treating psychological inflation involved helping patients recognize the difference between healthy self-confidence and archetypal possession. He used techniques like dream analysis and active imagination to help people reconnect with their authentic selves beneath the inflated ego. Jung discovered that there's one specific question you can ask that will immediately reveal whether someone is psychologically inflated. This question has saved countless people from years of psychological abuse. I'll share it with you in the next section. The 5th unacceptable behavior Jung identified is the unconscious projection of parent complexes onto romantic partners, turning your lover into a psychological parent figure. Jung understood that we all carry within us internalized images of our parents, what he called parent complexes. These complexes contain both positive and negative aspects of our early relationships and continue to influence our adult connections. When someone unconsciously projects their parent complex onto their romantic partner, they're no longer relating to their partner as an equal adult. Instead, they're trying to recreate or resolve childhood dynamics through their romantic relationship. A person projecting a mother complex might expect their partner to be unconditionally nurturing, always available, and constantly attuned to their needs. They become the eternal child, expecting to be taken care of without reciprocating adult responsibility. Similarly, someone projecting a father complex might expect their partner to be the ultimate authority, making all decisions and providing structure and direction. They avoid taking responsibility for their own life choices and instead look to their partner to be their psychological parent. Jung observed that these projections create relationships that feel more like parent-child dynamics than partnerships between equals. The person receiving the projection often feels burdened by impossible expectations and the pressure to be something they're not. What makes parent complex projection particularly destructive is that it prevents the development of mature love. Jung believed that authentic love requires two individuated people coming together as equals, not one person trying to parent another adult. The projected upon partner often finds themselves feeling more like a caregiver than a lover. They might enjoy the feeling of being needed at first, but eventually the lack of reciprocity and adult partnership becomes suffocating. Jung's treatment for parent complex projection involved helping patients recognize when they were seeking parental qualities in romantic partners and learning to develop those qualities within themselves. This process, which he called individuation, is essential for healthy adult relationships. The most insidious aspect of parent complex projection is that it often masquerades as love or devotion. The projecting person might say things like, "I need you," or "You're everything to me." But what they're really expressing is a childlike dependency rather than mature love. The sixth behavior Jung considered absolutely unacceptable is what he termed psychological sadism, the deliberate infliction of psychological pain for the purpose of control or gratification. Jung distinguished between ordinary cruelty, which might arise from anger or frustration, and psychological sadism, which involves a systematic pattern of causing emotional harm for its own sake. The psychological sadist derives pleasure from their partner's pain, confusion, or degradation. This behavior often manifests as subtle cruelty disguised as humor, criticism, or honesty. The sadist might make cutting remarks about their partner's appearance, intelligence, or worth, then claim they were just joking or trying to help when confronted. Jung observed that psychological sadists often have what he called an inverted relationship with power. Unable to feel powerful in healthy ways, they derive their sense of strength from making others feel weak, confused, or diminished. The most dangerous aspect of psychological sadism is its incremental nature. It rarely starts with obvious abuse. Instead, it begins with small cuts, tiny undermining comments, subtle put-downs that gradually erode the victim's self-esteem and psychological stability. Jung noted that psychological sadists are often highly intelligent and skilled at identifying their partner's vulnerabilities. They know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The effect on victims is devastating. Jung observed that people subjected to psychological sadism often develop what he called psychological fragmentation, a splitting of the psyche, where they lose touch with their own perceptions and begin to see themselves through their abuser's eyes. What makes psychological sadism particularly insidious is that the sadist often alternates between cruelty and kindness, creating what Jung called psychological intermittent reinforcement. This pattern is highly addictive and makes it extremely difficult for victims to leave. Jung's approach to treating both sadists and their victims involved deep analysis of power dynamics and the shadow aspects of personality. He believed that psychological sadism often arose from the perpetrator's own experiences of powerlessness and humiliation. The key to recognizing psychological sadism, according to Jung, is to pay attention to patterns rather than individual incidents. A psychological sadist will consistently find ways to diminish their partner's sense of self-worth and psychological stability. The seventh unacceptable behavior Jung identified is emotional incest, when someone uses their romantic partner to fulfill emotional needs that should be met through other relationships or personal development. Jung understood that healthy individuals have a diverse network of emotional connections, friends, family, colleagues, and communities that fulfill different psychological needs. When someone makes their romantic partner responsible for meeting all their emotional needs, it creates an unhealthy psychological fusion. Emotional incest occurs when someone treats their partner like a therapist, best friend, parent, and lover, all rolled into one. They share inappropriate details about their inner life, expect constant emotional availability, and become possessive of their partner's time and attention. This behavior often manifests as an inability to maintain other relationships. The emotionally incestuous person becomes jealous of their partner's friendships, family relationships, and outside interests. They want to be the center of their partner's emotional universe. Jung observed that emotional incest creates what he called psychological enmeshment, a fusion of identities where it becomes impossible to tell where one person ends and the other begins. This prevents the individuation process that Jung believed was essential for psychological health. The person on the receiving end of emotional incest often feels suffocated by the intensity of their partner's emotional demands. They might enjoy feeling needed and important at first, but eventually the lack of personal space and psychological boundaries becomes overwhelming. What makes emotional incest particularly dangerous is that it often masquerades as intimacy or deep connection. The emotionally incestuous person might say things like, "We're soulmates," or "We complete each other." But what they're really describing is psychological fusion rather than healthy intimacy. Jung believed that authentic love requires two whole, individuated people coming together while maintaining their separate identities. Emotional incest prevents this by creating a psychological merger that stunts both partners' emotional growth. The healing process for emotional incest involves learning to differentiate between healthy intimacy and psychological fusion. Jung's concept of individuation is crucial here. Both partners need to develop their own separate identities and emotional resources. Jung noted that people prone to emotional incest often have unresolved attachment issues from childhood. They never learn to self-soothe or develop internal emotional resources, so they expect their romantic partner to fulfill all their emotional needs. The eighth and ninth behaviors Jung considered unacceptable are closely related: psychological manipulation and what we now call gaslighting, the systematic distortion of reality to maintain control over another person. Jung understood that some individuals have what he called a manipulative complex, an unconscious pattern of relating to others through control and deception rather than authentic connection. These people see relationships as games to be won rather than partnerships to be nurtured. Psychological manipulation involves using emotional leverage to get what you want without regard for your partner's well-being. The manipulator might use guilt, fear, obligation, or shame to control their partner's behavior and decision-making. Jung observed that manipulators often have highly developed intuitive abilities that they use destructively. They can sense their partner's vulnerabilities and insecurities, then exploit these weaknesses to maintain dominance in the relationship. Gaslighting, though Jung didn't use this term, is something he understood deeply through his concept of psychological reality distortion. This involves systematically undermining your partner's perception of reality, making them question their own memory, judgment, and sanity. The gaslighter might deny conversations that clearly happened, rewrite history to make themselves look better, or convince their partner that their emotional reactions are crazy or oversensitive. This creates what Jung called psychological vertigo, a loss of stable ground for understanding reality. Jung noted that both manipulation and gaslighting are forms of psychological violence that can be more damaging than physical abuse. They attack the very foundation of a person's sense of self and reality, creating deep psychological wounds that can take years to heal. The most insidious aspect of these behaviors is that they often escalate gradually. The manipulator or gaslighter starts with small distortions and gradually increases the intensity as their partner becomes more psychologically dependent and confused. Jung's treatment for manipulation and gaslighting victims involved what he called reality reconstruction, helping patients reconnect with their own perceptions and rebuild their psychological foundation. This process requires tremendous courage and often external support. The key to recognizing manipulation and gaslighting, according to Jung, is to trust your own perceptions and feelings, even when your partner insists you're wrong. Jung believed that our unconscious mind is an excellent detector of deception and manipulation. The 10th and final behavior Jung considered absolutely unacceptable is what he called psychological vampirism through trauma bonding, using shared trauma or crisis to create an unhealthy psychological bond that prevents growth and healing. Jung observed that some individuals unconsciously seek out or create crisis situations in their relationships because they've learned to equate intensity with intimacy. They mistake the adrenaline and emotional chaos of trauma bonding for genuine love and connection. This behavior involves deliberately creating or perpetuating problems, drama, and emotional instability to maintain a sense of closeness with their partner. The trauma bonder might pick fights, create emergencies, or refuse to heal from past wounds because they fear that peace and stability will lead to abandonment. Jung understood that trauma bonding creates what he called artificial intimacy, a false sense of connection based on shared suffering rather than genuine compatibility and mutual growth. People caught in trauma bonds often mistake intensity for love and chaos for passion. The devastating effect of trauma bonding is that it prevents both partners from developing healthy coping mechanisms and emotional regulation skills. Instead of growing together, they remain stuck in cycles of crisis and reconciliation that exhaust their psychological resources. Jung noted that trauma bonding often develops from childhood experiences where love was conditional and chaotic. People who experienced inconsistent care as children sometimes unconsciously recreate these patterns in their adult relationships. The healing process for trauma bonding involves learning to differentiate between healthy intensity and destructive chaos. Jung believed that genuine love creates peace and growth, not constant drama and emotional upheaval. These 10 behaviors that Carl Jung identified as absolutely unacceptable in relationships aren't just psychological theory, they're practical wisdom that can save your sanity and your soul. If you recognize any of these patterns in your own relationship, remember that awareness is the first step toward change. Jung believed that we all have the capacity for psychological growth and healing, but it requires courage to face the truth about our relationships and ourselves. The path to authentic love begins with refusing to tolerate behaviors that diminish our psychological well-being. If this video has opened your eyes to patterns you hadn't recognized before, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because understanding Jung's insights into human psychology could be the key to creating the authentic, healthy relationship you deserve. Remember, you are worthy of love that builds you up, not tears you down. You deserve a relationship that supports your growth, not stunts it. And most importantly, you have the power to choose what you will and will not accept in your relationships. The journey towards psychological health and authentic love begins with a single step: deciding that you deserve better. Take that step today.